Excerpt from Synchronicity and Acausal Connecting Principle by Carl Jung. The problem of synchronicity has puzzled me for a long time, ever since the middle 20s, when I was investigating the phenomena of the collective unconscious and kept on coming across connections which I simply could not explain as chance groupings or runs. What I found were coincidences which were connected so meaningfully that their chance concurrence would represent a degree of improbability that would have to be expressed by an astronomical figure. By way of example, I shall mention an incident from my own observation. A young woman I was treating had, at a critical moment, a dream in which she was given a golden scarab. While she was telling me this dream, I sat with my back to the closed window. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, like a gentle tapping. I turned round and saw a flying insect knocking against the window pane from outside. I opened the window and caught the creature in the air as it flew in. It was the nearest analog to a golden scarab that one finds in our latitudes, a scarabid beetle, the common rose chafer, Setonia aurata, which, contrary to its usual habits, had evidently felt an urge to get into a dark room at this particular moment. I must admit that nothing like it ever happened to me before or since, and that the dream the patient has remained unique in my experience. I should like to mention another case that is typical of a certain category of events. The wife of one of my patients, a man in his 50s, once told me in conversation that, at the deaths of her mother and her grandmother, a number of birds gathered outside the windows of the death chamber. I had heard similar stories from other people. When her husband's treatment was nearing its end, his neurosis having been cleared up, he developed some apparently quite innocuous symptoms which seemed to me, however, to be those of heart disease. I sent along to a specialist who, after examining him, told me in writing that he could find no cause for anxiety. On the way from this consultation, with the medical report in his pocket, my patient collapsed in the street. As he was brought dying, his wife was already in a great state of anxiety because soon after her husband had gone to the doctor, a whole flock of birds alighted on their house. She naturally remembered similar incidents that had happened at the death of her relatives and feared the worst. Although I was personally acquainted with the people concerned and know very well that the facts here reported are true, I do not imagine for a moment that this will induce anybody who is determined to regard such things as pure chance to change his mind. My sole object in relating these two incidents is simply to give some indication of how meaningful coincidences usually present themselves in practical life. The meaningful connection is obvious enough in the first case in view of the approximate identity of the chief objects, the scarab and the beetle, but in the second case, the death and the flock of birds seem to be incommensurable with one another. If one considers face, however, that in the Babylonian Hades, the souls wore a feather dress, and that in ancient Egypt the Ba, or soul, was thought of as a bird, it is not too far-fetched to suppose that there may be some archetypal symbolism at work. Had such an incident occurred in a dream, that interpretation would be justified by the comparative psychological material. There also seems to be an archetypal foundation to the first case. It was an extraordinarily difficult case to treat, and up to the time of the dream, little or no progress had been made. I should explain that the main reason for this was my patient's animus, which was steeped in Cartesian philosophy and clung so rigidly to its own idea of reality that the efforts of 3 doctors, I was the third, had not been able to weaken it. Evidently, something quite irrational was needed which was beyond my powers to produce. The dream alone was enough to disturb ever so slightly the rationalistic attitude of my patient. But when the scarab came flying in through the window, in actual fact, her natural being could burst through the armor of her animus possession, and the process of transformation could at last begin to move. Any essential change of attitude signifies a psychic renewal, which is usually accompanied by symbols of rebirth in the patient's dreams and fantasies. The scarab is a classic example of a rebirth symbol. The ancient Egyptian book of What is in the Netherworld describes how the dead sun god changes himself at the 10th station into Khepri, the scarab, and then, at the 12th station, mounts the barge which carries the rejuvenated sun god into the morning sky. The only difficulty here is that with educated people, cryptomnesia often cannot be ruled out with certainty, although my patient did not happen to know this symbol. But this does not alter the fact that the psychologist is continually coming up against cases where the emergence of symbolic parallels cannot be explained without the hypothesis of the collective unconscious. Meaningful coincidences, which are to be distinguished from meaningless chance groupings, therefore seem to rest on an archetypal foundation. At least all the cases in my experience, and there is a large number of them, show this characteristic. What that means I have already indicated above. Although anyone with my experience in this field can easily recognize their archetypal character, he will find it difficult to link them up with the psychic conditions in Rhine's experiments because the latter contain no direct evidence of any constellation of the archetype. Nor is the emotional situation the same as in my examples. Nevertheless, it must be remembered that with Rhine, the first series of experiments generally produced the best results, which then quickly fell off. But when it was possible to arouse a new interest in the essentially rather boring experiment, the results improved again. It follows from this that the emotional factor plays an important role. Affectivity, however, rests to a large extent on the instincts, whose formal aspect is the archetype. There is yet another psychological analogy between my two cases and the Rhine experiments, though it is not quite so obvious. These apparently quite different situations have as their common characteristic an element of impossibility. The patient with the scarab found herself in an impossible situation because the treatment had got stuck, and there seemed to be no way out of the impasse. In such situations, if they are serious enough, archetypal dreams are likely to occur, which point out a possible line of advance one would never have thought of oneself. It is this kind of situation that constellates the archetype with the greatest regularity. In certain cases, the psychotherapist therefore sees himself obliged to discover there is yet another psychological analogy between my two cases and the Rhine experiments, though it is not quite so obvious. These apparently quite different situations have as their common characteristic an element of impossibility. The patient with the scarab found herself in an impossible situation because the treatment had got stuck and there seemed to be no way out of the impasse. In such situations, if they are serious enough, archetypal dreams are likely to occur, which point out a possible line of advance one would never have thought of oneself. It is this kind of situation that constellates the archetype with the greatest regularity. In certain cases, the psychotherapist therefore sees himself obliged to discover the rationally insoluble problem towards which the patient's unconscious is steering. Once this is found, the deeper layers of the unconscious, the primordial images, are activated and the transformation of the personality can get underway. In the second case, there was the half-unconscious fear and the threat of a lethal end with no possibility of an adequate recognition of the situation. In Rhine's experiment, it is the impossibility of the task that ultimately fixes the subject's attention on the processes going on inside him and thus gives the unconscious a chance to manifest itself. The questions set by the ESP experiment have an emotional effect right from the start, since they postulate something unknowable as being potentially knowable and in that way take the possibility of a miracle seriously into account. This, regardless of the subject's skepticism, immediately appeals to his unconscious readiness to witness a miracle and to the hope, latent in all men, that such a thing may yet be possible. Primitive superstition lies just below the surface of even the most tough-minded individuals, and it is precisely those who most fight against it who are the first to succumb to its suggestive effects. When therefore a serious experiment with all the authority of science behind it touches this readiness, it will inevitably give rise to an emotion which either accepts or rejects it with a good deal of effectivity. At all events, an effective expectation is present in one form or another, even though it may be denied.